Disclaimer: the following program is designed to offend, provoke, and challenge your religious sensibilities. It contains content that will likely offend anyone who holds religion sacred. This is for those with thick skin or a taste for the harsh truth. If you're easily offended or cherish your religious views, please turn off now. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned. So exciting. I've been wanting to do this video for a while. The rapture, the idea that one day Jesus is going to beam up all the good little believers like an overzealous UFO enthusiast, while the rest of us get left behind to fend off the Antichrist, global disasters, and whatever doomsday fantasy is selling best that decade. Because nothing says loving God quite like mass abandonment followed by complete devastation. It's a staple of modern evangelicalism. People slap, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned, bumper stickers on their cars like that somehow proves they're right. While it's manning it and driving it, yeah, that's really convincing. Here's the big problem, though. This entire doctrine didn't exist for the first 1800 years of Christianity. That's right, Jesus never taught it, Paul never mentioned it, the early church had no idea what it was, and even the Protestant Reformers, who were rewriting Christian doctrine like a group project gone wrong, somehow completely missed it. So where did it come from? Did God just forget to mention it for nearly 2 millennia, or did some 19th century preacher conveniently make it up? And before we continue, do not like, comment, or subscribe. Seriously, don't hit the button. Don't ring the bell. If you support this kind of blasphemous content, you're basically volunteering to get left behind. But go ahead, take your chances. You'd think that if God had a master plan to beam up his favorite players of this game we call life before all hell broke loose, he'd have mentioned it to someone before the 19th century. Maybe snuck it into one of Paul's letters, or, I don't know, practically anywhere in the Bible. But no, instead, the entire foundation of rapture theology rests on the teachings of John Nelson Darby, a 19th century English preacher from the Plymouth Brethren movement. You probably haven't heard of them, and neither had most Christians, before Darby started meddling with end times theology. A link to Darby's Wikipedia page is down in the description in case you want to look at him further. So what exactly did Darby do? He came up with dispensationalism, which is just a fancy way of saying God changes the rules every few centuries. He decided that Christians wouldn't actually suffer during the Great Tribulation because, of course, modern believers get to skip the bad parts of history. And most importantly, he completely reworked biblical eschatology to include a secret rapture where true believers would be snatched away to heaven before things got bad, and a second coming where Jesus would come back again, since one dramatic return wasn't enough. The interesting part about all of this is that no Christian had ever believed this before. Not in the early church, not in medieval Christianity, not even in the wild Protestant sects that were willing to believe just about anything. This was entirely foreign to church history. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. That's just your opinion. The rapture is totally biblical. So let's do something Christians rarely do. Let's look at the evidence. I'm not just pulling this out of thin air. Everything I'm about to show you comes from a scholarly analysis on the origins of rapture theology, a document you can check out for yourself in the description. Now, this research tracks how John Nelson Darby completely reinvented Christian eschatology, introducing the pre-tribulation rapture and dispensationalism, a system that no Christian in history had documented before the 1800s. And this isn't just coming from some random blog. The research comes from Dr. Thomas Ice, a theologian with an extensive academic background in biblical prophecy. Who is Dr. Thomas Ice? And in case anyone wants to check his credentials, I've put them right there on the screen. No need to pause. I'll sum it up for you. The guy has degrees, did postdoctoral studies, and surprise, surprise, he co-founded a research center with Left Behind author Tim LaHaye. You can't make this stuff up. Author or co-author of over 30 books on eschatology and dispensationalism. He spent his entire career trying to prove Darby was right, while unintentionally highlighting that Darby introduced these doctrines in the 19th century. Now, before any rapture believers get too excited, yes, Dr. Ice is actually a defender of pre-tribulation rapture theology. So you can't just dismiss this as some biased atheist take. This is a pro-rapture scholar acknowledging that Darby was instrumental in formulating the doctrine. Darby taught that the second advent would be secret, an event sensible only to those who participated in it. There were, in effect, two second coming in Darby's eschatology. The church is first taken from the earth secretly, and then at a later time, Christ returns in a public second advent as described in Matthew 24. This is clear evidence that Darby invented the two-stage coming of Christ, something completely foreign to historical Christianity. Before him, Christians believed in one second coming, not a secret disappearance of believers followed by a later public return. He reworked biblical eschatology entirely, proving that the rapture doctrine isn't some long-lost truth, but a new theological creation from the 1800s. Darby came to understand that the church could be taken to heaven at any moment without signs preceding that event, in what would later be known as the pre-tribulational rapture of the church. This directly confirms that Darby introduced the idea that believers would vanish before the tribulation. No early Christian, medieval theologian, or even Protestant Reformer taught this. Darby single-handedly rewrote end times theology, making it up as he went. Darby developed a pessimistic view of the visible church, Christendom, and came to believe that it was in utter ruins. His realization of a change in dispensations laid the groundwork for the development of dispensationalism, since he saw a distinction between God's plan for the church and his plan for Israel. So not only did Darby invent pre-tribulationism, but he also crafted an entire theological system, dispensationalism, just to justify it. His view that God had different rules for different time periods is completely foreign to historic Christianity. Darby's manipulation of Scripture was so extreme that it reshaped modern evangelicalism, all based on a doctrine no one believed before him. So what inspired Darby to come up with this? A deep study of Scripture? Some long-lost manuscript? Nope. Possibly a teenage girl having a dramatic religious vision. Here's where it gets even weirder. Some historians believe that Darby wasn't the true originator of the rapture doctrine. Instead, he may have been influenced by a 15-year-old Scottish girl named Margaret MacDonald, who, in 1830, claimed she had a charismatic vision about Jesus taking believers before the final judgment. MacDonald's prophetic dream described a select group of true believers being taken up before the final judgment. This was not a widely accepted belief, even within the charismatic movements of her time. But Darby heard about it, liked the sound of it, and somehow, within a few decades, a brand new doctrine appeared in Christian theology. Again, the link to Margaret MacDonald's Wikipedia page is down in the description. You can explore it further there. So let's get this straight. For 1800 years, Christians somehow missed this crucial part of God's end times plan, and then suddenly, in 1830, a teenage girl in Scotland figures it out? Right, sure, sounds legit. Now, some scholars argue that Darby had already formed his rapture doctrine before MacDonald's vision, and that the two are unrelated. I also want to stop here for a second and point out that MacDonald's so-called vision wasn't even anything new. You can see parts of it on the screen here. Her wording directly echoes 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 and 17, the same verse rapture believers love to cite. "'Tis Christ in us that will lift us up. 'Tis only those that are alive in him that will be caught up to meet him in the air." That's basically a paraphrase of what Paul already wrote. So even if her vision played a role in the spread of rapture theology, it wasn't some groundbreaking revelation. It was just a charismatic teenager repeating biblical phrases. And yet somehow this gets framed as the moment Christians rediscovered God's grand plan. If that's the case, then Darby and his followers must have been seriously desperate for validation. Others point out that MacDonald's vision wasn't even a pre-tribulation rapture. She described believers enduring trials before being taken. And they're not entirely wrong, but the problem is it doesn't actually matter. Even if Darby didn't directly lift his idea from MacDonald, he was still inventing something new out of thin air. Whether he got the idea from her vision or pulled it out of nowhere, the fact remains no Christian before the 19th century ever believed in a pre-tribulation rapture. There is no record of it in early church teachings, medieval theology, or even in Protestant Reformation writings. So if MacDonald didn't teach a pre-tribulation rapture, and no Christians before the 19th century taught it either, then where did Darby get it from? Well, the answer is pretty simple. He made it up. Whether it was influenced by MacDonald or not, it wasn't biblical, it wasn't historical, and it sure wasn't Christianity until the 1800s. Now, if Darby had just kept this nonsense to himself, we wouldn't even be talking about it. But no, this idea got a booster shot of evangelical marketing genius in the early 20th century. Enter Cyrus Ingerson Scofield, a former lawyer, Confederate soldier, and all-round sketchy dude. In 1909, he published the Scofield Reference Bible, which became one of the most influential Bibles in modern Christian history. It wasn't just a Bible. Scofield's version had footnotes, lots and lots of footnotes. And those footnotes just so happened to insert dispensationalist theology everywhere. This made it look like the rapture was actually in the Bible, even though it wasn't. Most readers didn't bother checking the difference between what the Bible actually said and Scofield's personal interpretations. And just like that, millions of American Christians were unknowingly converted to a brand new, completely fabricated doctrine. I'll link the Scofield Bible down below in the description as well. The result? Fundamentalist preachers ate it up. Revivalist movements used it for fear-based preaching. Evangelical churches taught it as fact, never bothering to check if it had any historical backing. So now, an idea that no Christian had ever believed before 1830 was suddenly considered a core doctrine of the faith. And this is why we now have movies, books, and doomsday cults based on a theology that didn't exist until a Confederate soldier slapped it into Bible footnotes. Let's break down the most commonly cited proof texts that rapture believers use and see just how flawed the logic gets. First, Thessalonians 4, verses 16 and 17, and the dead in Christ shall rise first, then we who are living, who are remaining over, together with them shall be caught away in clouds to meet the Lord in air, and so always with the Lord we shall be. Rapture believers claim this clearly describes believers being snatched into heaven, but nope. The passage says nothing about disappearing into heaven. It says believers will meet the Lord in the air, but doesn't say where they go after that. Now this is where things get interesting. The Greek word for meet, apantesis, has a very specific meaning in ancient Greek. It refers to a formal reception where people go out to meet an arriving dignitary and then escort them back to where they came from. This wasn't just a random word choice by Paul. It was a well-established cultural practice. But let's look at some actual examples of meet and apantesis, or apantesis being used in the Bible. Matthew 25, verse 6, behold the bridegroom, come out to meet apantesis him. The bridesmaids meet the groom and bring him into the wedding feast. Acts 28, verse 15. The brothers came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. They meet Paul and then escort him back to Rome. If Paul meant that believers would be taken away to heaven, he used the completely wrong word. In every other biblical use, apatesis refers to a meeting followed by a return, not a permanent relocation. The clear implication is that believers are rising to meet Christ and then escorting him back to earth. Now, some rapture defenders try to argue that this word doesn't necessarily require an immediate return. But even if we grant that possibility, the burden of proof is still on them to explain why Paul suddenly changed its meaning here, something no biblical text supports. So if we're being consistent with how the word is actually used, this verse actually describes Jesus coming to earth, not believers disappearing. Oops. All right, next one. This is fun, right? I'm always having fun. Matthew 24, verses 40 and 41. Let's take a good look at them. Then 2 men shall be in the field. The one is received and the one is left. This is one of the go-to verses for rapture believers. Sounds like one person is taken away, right? Classic rapture scene here, right? Context is key, right? Let's just add in those pesky little verses right before this. This passage is about judgment, not salvation. You can't just pluck a verse out and ignore what's happening around it. In the previous verses, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the age. He's not describing believers disappearing before the tribulation. He's describing judgment. Jesus literally compares it to the days of Noah, which should make you ask, who was taken in Noah's time? The wicked people who drowned. The ones left behind were Noah and his family, the righteous. Being taken is actually a bad thing in this passage. Jesus is saying you don't want to be the one taken. This is about people being taken in judgment, not raptured into heaven. But rapture believers completely reverse the meaning because, again, they need this verse to say something it doesn't. So congratulations, rapture crowd. You're cheering for the fate of the flood victims. You want to be taken? Sounds like saying, man, I really hope I'm first in line for the great divine drowning, because if we actually follow Jesus' logic here, the people left behind are the ones who survive. So isn't this verse actually an anti-rapture verse? Let's recap. 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, not a rapture verse. It describes believers greeting Jesus as he returns. Matthew 24:40 and 41, also not a rapture verse. The people being taken are the ones being judged. So we're 2 verses in, and already the case for the rapture is looking pretty dismal. But don't worry, it only gets worse, because the next proof texts they use even more ludicrous. Up next, Revelation, where the rapture is supposed to be, but isn't. Revelation is the end times book, right? The grand finale, the ultimate showdown between God, Satan, and a bunch of unfortunate humans caught in the middle. So if the rapture were real, you'd expect Revelation to be screaming about it from start to finish. I mean, we get horses of the apocalypse, demons crawling out of the abyss, fire raining from the sky, and people getting their foreheads stamped like cattle. But for some reason, the single most important event in modern evangelical eschatology, millions of believers disappearing, is nowhere to be found. And you might be asking now, wait, the rapture isn't in Revelation? No, it's not. Not a word, not even a hint. In fact, Revelation directly contradicts the entire rapture doctrine. Here's why. Revelation never mentions believers vanishing before the tribulation. If the rapture were real, you'd expect a very obvious moment where all the Christians just disappear. Instead, Revelation shows believers still on earth, suffering right alongside everyone else. Revelation makes it very clear that Christians are persecuted during the tribulation. Revelation 13:7 says the beast will make war against the saints and overcome them. How exactly is he waging war on Christians if they're all supposed to be gone? Did the Antichrist just not get the rapture memo? Let me be perfectly clear, there is no escape clause anywhere in the book. Revelation describes a world that gets progressively worse, but at no point does it say, and then, suddenly, all the good Christians disappeared and the rest suffered horribly. The believers are still there, enduring all of it. And yet, modern rapture believers will twist anything they can to shove their doctrine into Revelation. Since Revelation never actually mentions the rapture, preachers had to get creative. Here's their go-to move. Revelation 4 verse 1, John goes to heaven. After these things I saw, and lo, a door opened in the heaven, and the first voice that I heard, as of a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up hither, and I will show thee what behoveth to come after these things. That's it. That's the verse they use to claim the rapture happens in Revelation. Yes, you heard that correctly. A voice tells John, the guy writing the book, to come up to heaven in a personal vision, and somehow this means millions of Christians are going to disappear one day. John being called up to heaven is a symbolic vision. It's not a literal event. It's merely John seeing a vision of future events, not the church being raptured. If this were really describing the rapture, it would be the worst explanation possible. One guy gets called up, and we're just supposed to assume this means every Christian in history is going to vanish? That's a massive leap. This is what happens when you desperately need the Bible to say something it doesn't. Instead of supporting the rapture, Revelation destroys it. Christians are still on earth during the tribulation. There's no secret escape. They are being hunted and persecuted. Jesus only returns once. There's no two-phase return of Christ. Revelation 19 describes Jesus coming back in full force, not making a pit stop to secretly take some people first. The entire book is about endurance, not escape. Revelation is literally about Christians enduring persecution. If Jesus was planning to whisk them all away before things got bad, why does Revelation constantly tell them to stand firm and remain faithful? So the biggest book about the apocalypse doesn't mention the rapture. The only way to find the rapture in Revelation is to pretend John's vision somehow represents all Christians. Everywhere Revelation does talk about believers, they're still on earth suffering through the tribulation. This is why preachers don't actually want you to read Revelation carefully, because the moment you do, you realize the rapture was never there to begin with. I'm probably getting a little ranty, but really, I don't even care. It'll probably only get worse from here on out. Now that we've shredded the so-called biblical evidence, let's take a look at the logical and theological nightmare that is the rapture doctrine. Because even if the Bible did teach it, it still wouldn't make any sense. Even if we ignored the fact that the rapture was invented in the 19th century, and even if we pretended that none of the biblical evidence we just debunked was misinterpreted garbage, the doctrine still wouldn't make any sense, because the rapture turns God into an inconsistent, arbitrary, and frankly poor storyteller. The first and biggest red flag is that the entire early church missed it. If the rapture were so important, why did literally no one in the early church believe in it? Christians in the first few centuries were obsessed with the apocalypse. They wrote endlessly about Jesus returning, the final judgment, the Antichrist, tribulation, and resurrection. Yet not one of them mentions a pre-tribulation rapture. Think about that for a second. These were people living under brutal Roman persecution. Many of them thought the end was coming in their lifetime. If there was ever a group of Christians who would have clung to the hope of getting beamed up before the world went to hell, it was them. And yet, Paul never teaches a rapture. Peter never teaches a rapture. John, who supposedly saw the end of the world in Revelation, never mentions a rapture. This is where things get downright hilarious. The entire Bible repeatedly tells believers to expect suffering, persecution, and trials. Jesus himself says it. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. John 16:33. Ye shall be hated by all because of my name. Luke 21:17. If they have persecuted me, they will persecute you also. John 15:20. The consistent message is expect suffering, stay faithful through trials, endure until the end. Then suddenly in the 1800s, we get a new version of Christianity that says, oh, don't worry, you won't have to suffer. God's going to teleport you out of here before things get bad. Excuse me, what about all the Christians who've already suffered? The early Christians thrown to lions under Nero, why didn't they get raptured? The martyrs were burned at the stake for refusing to renounce Christ. Where was their holy escape hatch? Christians suffering in persecution today, why do they have to endure while American evangelicals get a pass to heaven? If God was going to rapture people before things got bad, you'd think he might have started with the ones facing some overly enthusiastic Roman entertainment, but no. Modern evangelicals seem to be the first generation that actually gets a fast pass out of suffering. First century believers tossed into less than friendly encounters with nature's apex predators. Christians in medieval times, let's just say they got a little too familiar with fire. Christians under oppressive regimes, locked up, beaten, and silenced. Modern Christians, poof, holy space elevator. What changed? Did God suddenly decide he's in the business of handing out gold stars for participation? The logical inconsistency here is amazing. At its core, the rapture is just Christian escapism. It's a get out of suffering free card for people who don't like the idea of actually enduring trials. It turns Christianity from a faith about endurance and perseverance into a faith about dodging hardship altogether. And somehow modern believers don't even question how completely ludicrous that is. By now we've established that the rapture was invented in the 19th century. The Bible doesn't actually teach it. The doctrine makes God look wildly inconsistent, so that raises the biggest question. If the rapture is a theological fraud, why do millions of Christians still believe it? Simply put, because it benefits them. The rapture isn't just a doctrine, it's a product. And like any good product, it plays to human ego, fear, and profit. One of the biggest selling points of the rapture is that it makes believers feel special. Think about it. You're not just saved, you're handpicked. You don't have to endure hardships, you get an instant upgrade to paradise. While everyone else is struggling through chaos, disaster, and collapse, you get to skip the whole ordeal and watch from safety. The rapture turns Christianity into an exclusive club. It's the ultimate I told you so moment for those eagerly anticipating the downfall of everyone else. That's why so many buy into it. It lets them feel important, like they've secured a first-class seat on the last flight out. It reframes their faith into a global disaster movie where they're the main characters. It even gives them permission to check out from the real world's problems. After all, why worry about a collapsing planet if you won't be here for the finale? The rapture isn't about theology, it's about being on the winning team. It's the perfect fear tactic. The rapture isn't just about stroking egos, it's also the ultimate religious scare tactic. For centuries, Christianity used hell to scare people into converting, but in modern times, hell has lost some of its dread. So what's even scarier than eternal torment? Being abandoned by God in an apocalyptic nightmare. Cue the rapture. For decades, pastors have used it to terrify people into obedience. Imagine waking up one day and your entire family is gone. Planes are crashing, chaos is everywhere, and you're stuck here because you didn't accept Jesus. This is one of the most effective fear-based recruitment tools in Christianity. Don't believe? You'll be left behind. Not sure? Better get baptized again, just in case. Want to leave the church? Hope you like tribulation, buddy. And the best part? It never expires. Every new generation is told they are the last. Every war, every political crisis, every natural disaster is used as proof that the rapture is coming soon. It's an endlessly reusable doomsday prophecy because as long as people believe it's coming any day now, they stay locked in fear. And if you really want to know why the rapture became mainstream, just follow the money. Once evangelicals figured out that people would pay to be scared, they started milking this thing for everything it was worth. The Left Behind franchise, a multi-million-dollar rapture circus, includes 16 books, 4 movies, video games, spin-offs, and merchandise, with over 80 million copies sold, all based on a doctrine that didn't exist before the 1800s. And here's the best part. Every book ends with a cliffhanger, so people have to buy the next one. I know, I read every single one of those books. I thought the books were amazing, confirmed everything I ever believed. But every movie capitalizes on fear, ensuring believers stay paranoid. And every time a real-world crisis occurs, sales spike again. It's pure marketing genius. Because here's the thing, the more frightened people are, the more they buy. The more they buy, the more preachers push the rapture. The more preachers push the rapture, the more terrified people become. It's a self-sustaining business model built on fear, ignorance, and bad theology. And it works. I could go on, but at this point I'm mostly ranting, so I'll sign off now and say, if you're waiting for the rapture, I've got bad news, it's not coming. But hey, at least you're in good company with the flood victims from Matthew 24. I'll see you suckers in the tribulation.